Picture this, a beautiful summer afternoon in an upscale neighborhood in Boston. Sarah Chen, a hardworking software engineer and single mother, is finally living her dream. After years of saving every penny and working countless overtime hours debugging code, she managed to buy her dream house, a charming colonial with a crystal-clear swimming pool that sparkles under the Massachusetts sun. But her moment of peace is about to be shattered. As Sarah reclines in her lounge chair, eyes closed and enjoying the warm breeze, a deep voice breaks the tranquility. "I see you're enjoying my swimming spot." Sarah sits up with a start. A tall man stands at her gate, arms crossed and a look of casual entitlement on his face. Through his practiced smile, she can see irritation in his eyes. This is her first encounter with Richard Sullivan, former police captain and self-appointed neighborhood watchdog. And little does she know, it's just the beginning of her nightmare. Before we continue this journey of patience and persistence, hit that subscribe button and notification bell if you've ever dealt with entitled neighbors or workplace bullies. Your support helps us bring more stories of quiet strength and strategic justice straight to your feed. Now, back to Sarah's battle. Before we continue this journey of patience and persistence, hit that subscribe button and notification bell if you've ever dealt with entitled neighbors or workplace bullies. Your support helps us bring more stories of quiet strength and strategic justice straight to your feed. Now back to Sarah's battle. Sarah was proudly moving into her new home with her 10-year-old daughter, Lily. After a decade of building her career in tech, she'd finally achieved what her immigrant parents could only dream of: owning a house in one of Boston's most prestigious neighborhoods. The previous owners had maintained the property beautifully, especially the backyard pool that had caught Sarah's eye from day one. "Mom, can we swim today?" Lily asked excitedly, pressing her face against the window overlooking their new backyard. "As soon as we unpack the essentials," Sarah promised, ruffling her daughter's hair. She was arranging kitchen supplies when the doorbell rang. Standing on her porch was a gray-haired man in his late 50s, wearing an expensive golf shirt with the local country club logo. "Welcome to the neighborhood," he said, extending his hand. "Richard Sullivan, I live next door." "Sarah Chen, nice to meet you." His smile didn't quite reach his eyes as they darted over her shoulder to peek inside her home. "The Andersons and I were close. I've been keeping an eye on the place since they moved." "That's nice of you," Sarah replied, unsure why his tone made her uncomfortable. "They always appreciated having a former police captain nearby. Security is important in this neighborhood," he said, emphasizing his former title. "We have certain standards here." Before Sarah could respond, he added, "By the way, I usually swim laps around 3 p.m. The Andersons never minded. We had an arrangement." Sarah blinked in confusion. "An arrangement?" "Nothing formal, just neighborly courtesy. See you around, neighbor." Richard turned and walked away before she could respond. Later that evening, Sarah was startled by the sound of her back gate opening. Looking through the window, she watched in disbelief as Richard strolled into her backyard in swimming trunks, carrying a towel, acting as if he owned the place. Sarah rushed outside. "Excuse me, but what are you doing?" Richard looked surprised by the question. "My daily swim, of course. Like I mentioned, the Andersons and I had an arrangement." "Mr. Sullivan, I'm not the Andersons. This is my property now," Sarah stated firmly. Richard's friendly facade slipped for a moment. "Look, I helped the Andersons maintain this pool for years. I've been swimming here daily for the past decade. It's practically a fixture of my routine." "I understand, but you need to ask permission before entering my property," Sarah insisted. His expression hardened. "I didn't realize the neighborhood was changing quite so dramatically. The Andersons understood community values?" The implication hung in the air as he reluctantly gathered his things. As he left, he turned back. "You know, Chief Williams and I go way back. We play golf every Thursday. This neighborhood has always been tight-knit, very selective about who moves in." It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. What made Richard Sullivan truly dangerous wasn't his former police captain status. It was his charm. Unlike the stereotypical angry neighbor, Richard was beloved in the community. He organized the annual 4th of July block party, volunteered at the local Veterans Center, and served as a youth baseball coach. His Christmas light display had been featured in the local paper 3 years running. Sarah discovered this complicated reality when she took Lily to the neighborhood playground the next day. A friendly woman with a toddler approached them. "You must be the new family on Maple Street. I'm Grace Wilson, just down the block from you." Sarah introduced herself and Lily, grateful for the warm welcome. "How are you settling in?" Grace asked. "Pretty well, though I had an odd encounter with my neighbor yesterday. Richard Sullivan? He seems to think he has swimming privileges in my backyard pool." Grace's bright smile dimmed slightly. "Oh, Richard? He's practically an institution around here. His fundraiser for the Children's Hospital last year raised over $50,000. "That's impressive," Sarah acknowledged, "but he literally walked into my backyard without permission." Grace lowered her voice. "Between us, Richard can be territorial. He was very close with the Andersons, some say too close. There were rumors about him and Mrs. Anderson after her husband's health declined." "What happened to Mr. Anderson?" Sarah asked. "Dementia. Spent his last 2 years in a care facility. Richard helped Mrs. Anderson with the house maintenance. I think he genuinely believes he's partly responsible for your property." Grace hesitated. "Just tread carefully. Richard has friends everywhere." As if summoned by their conversation, Richard appeared at the playground, surrounded by a group of children clutching baseball mitts. He spotted Sarah and waved cheerfully, as if their confrontation had never happened. "Sarah, glad to see you exploring the neighborhood, and this must be your daughter." He approached, the very picture of community spirit. Sarah felt Lily inch closer to her side. "I'm coaching Little League this afternoon. We could always use another player if she's interested," Richard offered, his smile broad and genuine. Before Sarah could respond, Grace jumped in. "Richard is the best coach in the league. His team has won championships 3 years in a row." Several parents around the playground nodded in agreement. Richard basked in the admiration, then checked his watch. "I should get these future MVPs to practice. Sarah, about yesterday, I realize I might have overstepped. Old habits, you know. The Andersons were like family." His expression was perfectly contrite. "Perhaps we could discuss pool privileges sometime. I'm happy to contribute to the maintenance costs." With a friendly nod, he herded the children toward the baseball diamond, leaving Sarah stunned by his absolute pivot in behavior. "See?" Grace whispered. "That's classic Richard. Public apology, reasonable request. If you refuse now, you'll look like the difficult one." On their walk home, Sarah noticed how many neighbors waved to her. Clearly, word had spread about the new family. What she couldn't miss was how many of those same neighbors had Sullivan for City Council signs in their yards. This wasn't just a boundary dispute with a difficult neighbor. This was a power struggle with a man who had spent decades cultivating influence and goodwill. Someone who could turn the entire community against her with a few well-placed comments. The next day, Sarah received an email from the Homeowners Association about multiple complaints regarding the unkempt appearance of her property, despite having moved in just days ago. When she checked her mailbox, she found a printed copy of the neighborhood's extensive rule book, with several pool-related regulations highlighted. That evening, a middle-aged couple appeared at her door with a casserole. "We're the Millers from across the street," the woman explained. "Thought you could use a home-cooked meal while you're settling in." "That's incredibly kind," Sarah said, genuinely touched. As they chatted, Mrs. Miller mentioned, "We noticed the HOA citation. Don't take it personally. They do that to all newcomers. Richard actually tried to stop it, said you should have time to settle in first." Sarah's confusion must have shown on her face. "Oh, didn't you know? Richard chairs the Architectural Review Committee, has final say on all exterior modifications in the neighborhood." The information settled like a stone in Sarah's stomach. The man she'd refused had direct control over any changes she might want to make to her property. When Sarah took Lily swimming that weekend, she noticed Richard watching them from his window. Hours later, 2 police officers appeared at her door. "Ma'am, we've received noise complaints about screaming from your pool area," the younger officer explained. "Screaming? That was just my daughter laughing while we played Marco Polo," Sarah replied, confused. The older officer looked uncomfortable. "We have to follow up on all complaints, ma'am. Just try to keep it down." As they left, Sarah noticed Richard watching from his driveway, phone in hand. When their eyes met, he gave her a friendly wave, as if he hadn't just called the authorities on a child's laughter. The following week brought new surprises. Sarah returned home from work to find a landscaping crew in her backyard. "Excuse me? What are you doing here?" she demanded. The foreman looked up, confused. "Weekly pool maintenance. Mr. Sullivan arranged it years ago with the previous owners." "I didn't authorize this," Sarah insisted. "Ma'am, this service has been prepaid through the end of the season. Mr. Sullivan handles the scheduling for this whole block, gets us a group discount." The man showed her a contract with her address clearly listed. When Sarah confronted Richard that evening, his response was disarmingly reasonable. "I completely forgot to mention the service. The Andersons and I split the cost for years. I've already paid for this season, so consider it a housewarming gift." His smile was generous. The crew knows exactly how to maintain the pool chemistry. It's quite technical. The implication was clear. You're not equipped to handle this yourself. Sarah declined as politely as she could, but the damage was done. The landscapers now viewed her as difficult, and Richard as the reasonable one trying to help. Over the next 2 weeks, Richard's tactics evolved. He, coincidentally, hosted afternoon barbecues whenever Sarah planned pool time with Lily. Smoke would drift over the fence, making swimming unpleasant. When Sarah had colleagues over, someone called in a parking complaint about cars blocking the street, even though they were all properly parked. Most disturbing were the casual visits from police officers, former colleagues of Richard, dropping by to check in on various minor complaints. They were always professional, but made it clear that Richard had significant influence in the community. The breaking point came when Sarah discovered a water bill nearly triple what she expected. Investigation revealed that her pool had been completely drained and refilled overnight, an expensive process she hadn't authorized. Security camera footage showed Richard and 2 men she didn't recognize entering her property at 2 a.m., manually draining her pool, then refilling it. When confronted, Richard's explanation was both plausible and infuriating. "I noticed algae forming. Could have been dangerous for your daughter. Rather than wake you, I called in a favor with the pool company. They confirmed the water needed to be replaced immediately." He looked concerned. "I was trying to help, Sarah. Pool-borne illnesses are serious business." Sarah checked with 3 pool maintenance companies. None identified any issues that would warrant emergency draining. But to her neighbors, Richard was once again the hero, looking out for a child's safety while the inexperienced new homeowner slept. Sarah was no stranger to systematic intimidation. As one of the few women in senior engineering roles at her company, she'd learned that direct confrontation rarely worked against entrenched power. Instead, she turned to what she knew best, gathering data and building an irrefutable case. She discreetly installed security cameras covering her entire property. She created a spreadsheet documenting every incident, complete with timestamps, witnesses, and outcomes. When Richard accidentally turned on his sprinklers while her daughter's friends were having a playdate in her yard, she recorded it. When her trash cans were mysteriously tipped over on collection day, right after she declined his generous offer to maintain her pool, she added it to her log. But Sarah knew that documentation alone wouldn't be enough against someone with Richard's community standing. She needed to understand the man himself. Her investigation began with the previous owners. After finding Mrs. Anderson's contact information, Sarah called her under the pretense of asking about the home's quirks. "The house is lovely," Mrs. Anderson said warmly, "but I'm surprised Richard hasn't already told you everything. He practically lived there the last few years." With gentle prompting, Mrs. Anderson revealed a concerning pattern. Richard had initially offered occasional help after Mr. Anderson's diagnosis, but gradually inserted himself into every aspect of their lives. He gained access to their home, pool, and even financial decisions under the guise of assistance. "He was so helpful at first," Mrs. Anderson confessed. "But when we decided to sell, well, Richard had strong opinions about who should buy our home." "Did he want to buy it himself?" Sarah asked. No. Richard has his own beautiful house. He just felt entitled to have input. He'd invested so much time, you see. When we accepted your offer, he didn't speak to us for weeks." Sarah thanked Mrs. Anderson and hung up, pieces falling into place. Richard didn't just want pool access, he wanted control over a property he'd come to see as partially his. Further research revealed a pattern. The Rodriguez family had faced similar treatment when they moved in 2 years ago, eventually selling at a loss after repeated harassment. The young couple on Maple Street mentioned Richard had helpfully reported their fence height to the city inspector after they declined to use his recommended contractor. Mrs. Johnson, a widow, confided that Richard regularly inspected her yard for violations and had offered to take the burden of home ownership off her hands by purchasing her property at below market value. Most troubling was what Sarah learned from Grace Wilson during a carefully casual coffee date. Richard had been married once, decades ago, to a woman who owned a historical home in the neighborhood. "What happened to her?" Sarah asked. "Divorced after 3 years. She claimed he was obsessively controlling, scheduling her social calendar, rearranging her furniture while she was at work, even replacing her car without consulting her." Grace lowered her voice. Nobody believed her, of course. Richard was already a neighborhood fixture. She moved away, and he kept the house in the settlement. The picture emerging was of a man who collected properties and people like trophies, not through outright aggression, but through a carefully cultivated image of helpfulness that masked controlling behavior. Armed with this knowledge, Sarah adjusted her strategy. Rather than directly confronting Richard's racism and sexism, she methodically documented his pattern of boundary violations with multiple homeowners. She joined the local library board and volunteered at Lily's new school, building genuine connections in the community. She was careful never to mention Richard directly. She simply established herself as a valuable community member. When Richard mentioned his concerns about declining neighborhood standards at an HOA meeting while staring directly at her, she calmly asked him to clarify what standards he meant, forcing him to backpedal in front of everyone. For 3 months, Sarah endured Richard's campaign against her while building her case. The turning point came when she caught him on camera entering her backyard while she was at work, using what appeared to be a copy of her pool gate key. More disturbing, he wasn't swimming. He was examining her patio furniture, checking inside her storage shed, and once, even peering through her back windows. Sarah took her evidence to a lawyer who specialized in harassment cases. After reviewing her documentation, the attorney was blunt. "This isn't just a boundary issue. This is stalking." With legal guidance, Sarah obtained a formal cease and desist letter. Rather than deliver it immediately, she continued gathering evidence, knowing that Richard's facade of reasonableness masked a more troubling reality. The breaking point came unexpectedly. Sarah returned early from work one day to find Richard in her kitchen with a police officer. Lily, who had just arrived home from school, was clearly uncomfortable. "What's going on?" Sarah demanded. "There was a reported gas leak," Richard explained smoothly. Officer Jenkins and I were checking things out, making sure Lily was safe. I didn't report any gas leak, Sarah said, looking at the officer. The young officer shifted uncomfortably. The call came in anonymously, ma'am. Standard procedure to check it out. After the officer left, Sarah confronted Richard. How did you get into my house? The back door was unlocked, he claimed, though Sarah knew it wasn't. I was being a good neighbor, Sarah. If there really had been a gas leak, Lily could have been in danger. The intrusion into her home, with her daughter present, crossed a line. That night, Sarah reviewed her security footage and discovered something chilling. Richard had tried her front door handle before the police arrived, then made a call. Minutes later, the officer appeared, and Richard led him to the back door, which he opened with what appeared to be a key. The next day, Sarah requested a meeting with Police Chief Williams, bringing all her documentation. Richard had often invoked his friendship with the chief, but Sarah was determined to get an unfiltered perspective. To her surprise, Chief Williams gave her his full attention, reviewing her evidence with growing concern. Captain Sullivan was a good officer in his day, he said carefully, but he retired under complex circumstances. What does that mean? Sarah asked. The chief hesitated. There were concerns about his use of authority in the community. Nothing criminal, but enough of a pattern that we suggested early retirement. It was carefully worded, but Sarah understood. Richard had abused his position before. He's been telling people you're close friends, Sarah ventured. Chief Williams's expression darkened. We play in the same charity golf tournament once a year. That's the extent of our friendship. He leaned forward. Ms. Chen, what you've shown me goes beyond neighborly disputes. I'll have a word with some of my officers about responding to complaints at your address. As Sarah left the station, her phone chimed with a text from an unknown number. Parking lot, blue sedan. Cautiously approaching the vehicle, she recognized Officer Jenkins from the gas leak incident. He rolled down his window, looking nervously around the parking lot. I can't be seen talking to you, he said quietly. But you should know, Sullivan still has friends in the department. Not everyone, but enough. Why are you telling me this? Sarah asked. Because yesterday wasn't the first time he's had us check houses when owners weren't home. He always has a plausible reason. Water leak, alarm system alert. But it's always houses where he has interest. The officer passed her a flash drive. Security footage from the Miller's place last year. They were on vacation. Sullivan told us he was house-sitting. He wasn't. Sarah thanked him, understanding the risk he was taking. Be careful, he warned. Sullivan's not just persistent. He truly believes he's entitled to oversee this neighborhood. People who challenge that don't tend to stay long. Sarah's careful preparation paid off at the quarterly community town hall. When Richard rose to speak about security concerns in the neighborhood, Sarah raised her hand. Before we continue, she said calmly, I'd like to address a serious security issue that affects us all. She connected her laptop to the projector. For the past 3 months, someone has been repeatedly trespassing on my property. The screen showed crystal-clear footage of Richard entering her backyard on multiple occasions, testing her door handles, and even using her pool when she wasn't home. A murmur ran through the crowd. Richard's face reddened. This is taken out of context, he sputtered. The Andersons and I had an arrangement. I've spoken with the Andersons, Sarah interrupted, her voice level. They confirmed no such arrangement existed. They tolerated your behavior because they feared retaliation. The room fell silent as Sarah continued. I've documented 13 instances of trespassing, 7 cases of false complaints to authorities, and numerous HOA violations filed specifically targeting my property. She switched to the next slide, a statement from Chief Williams, Richard's supposed golf buddy. Furthermore, I've spoken with Chief Williams, who was disturbed to learn his officers were being called for frivolous complaints. He asked me to share that the department takes misuse of police resources very seriously. Richard looked around the room for support but found none. The community members who had once nodded along with his concerns now avoided his gaze. Then Sarah played her trump card. The security footage showing Richard entering her house before the police arrived for the non-existent gas leak. "This isn't just about my family," Sarah concluded. "Mrs. Rodriguez, the Millers, Mrs. Johnson. How many of you has Mr. Sullivan helped by inserting himself into your homes and lives without invitation?" To everyone's surprise, Mrs. Johnson stood up, her voice quavering. "He has a key to my house. I never gave it to him, but somehow he has one. I've found him in my garden, in my garage, always with some explanation about helping me." One by one, other neighbors shared similar experiences. Richard's assistance that crossed boundaries, his concerns that felt like threats, his community standards that seemed to apply differently to different residents. Richard's careful facade crumbled. "I've dedicated my life to this neighborhood," he shouted, mask finally slipping. "I've maintained standards, kept out undesirable elements, protected property values. Without me, this community would fall apart." The HOA president, a retired judge, cleared her throat. "Mr. Sullivan, I believe we need to discuss your resignation from all community committees, effective immediately." Richard stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The aftermath was not what Sarah expected. Rather than feeling triumphant, she felt a complex mixture of relief and concern. Richard Sullivan had been exposed, but he was still her next-door neighbor. For 2 weeks, his house remained quiet, blinds drawn. Then the retribution began, subtle at first. Dead plants appeared along their shared property line. Her mail occasionally went missing. Late-night calls came with no one on the other end. When Sarah's car tires were slashed, she took the evidence directly to Chief Williams. The security footage clearly showed Richard in her driveway at 3 a.m. This time, there was no community meeting, no public confrontation. 2 officers arrived quietly at Richard's home with a warrant. The search revealed not just a collection of keys to various neighborhood homes, but journals detailing his oversight of neighbors going back decades, who came and went, who made improvements without his approval, who defied his vision for the community. Most disturbing were the detailed logs of Sarah's daily routine. When she left for work, when Lily came home from school, which lights were on in which rooms at what times. Richard was arrested on stalking charges, with additional charges of breaking and entering, vandalism, and filing false police reports. His community standing crumbled overnight. Former supporters distanced themselves, claiming they'd always found him a bit intense. Sarah felt no pleasure in his downfall. She simply wanted peace and safety for her family and community. 3 months later, Richard accepted a plea deal that included mandatory psychological treatment. His house went on the market, listed by his sister who arrived from out of state to manage his affairs. Sarah's quiet victory wasn't in Richard's removal, but in what happened afterward. The HOA bylaws were revised to prevent concentration of power. Security workshops were organized for neighborhood families. Most importantly, a genuine community began to form, one based on mutual respect rather than fear and control. The Rodriguez family brought over homemade tamales as a thank you. The young couple from Maple Street invited Lily to their daughter's birthday party. Even some of Richard's former allies stopped by to introduce themselves properly. When summer arrived, Sarah hosted a pool party for the neighborhood kids. Parents who had once avoided eye contact now chatted comfortably as their children splashed in the water. "You know," said Mrs. Johnson, watching the children play, "this pool hasn't seen this much joy in years." The new family that moved into Richard's house, a young doctor and his husband, quickly became part of the neighborhood fabric. Their housewarming party spilled into adjoining yards, with neighbors bringing dishes and children running between houses. Sarah's security cameras still operated, but these days they captured different scenes: neighborhood children learning to swim, community gatherings, and occasionally, the local stray cat that had adopted her garden as its sunbathing spot. The following spring, a package arrived at Sarah's door. a pool maintenance kit with a note from the Andersons. "We heard what happened. Thank you for restoring the neighborhood we loved." As Sarah watched Lily perfect her cannonball dive, she reflected on how standing up to intimidation doesn't always require a dramatic showdown. Sometimes, the most powerful response to entitlement is building a meticulous case and creating genuine community connections that expose someone's true character. The crystal-clear pool that had been the battleground now served its intended purpose, a place of joy, community, and belonging. Sarah had won not by fighting fire with fire, but by steadily shining a light on the truth until the shadows had nowhere to hide. If you've ever dealt with entitled neighbors or workplace bullies, remember that sometimes the quiet approach wins the day. Have you used documentation or community building to handle difficult situations? Share your story in the comments below. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and notification bell if you want more tales of patience and justice prevailing. Your support helps us bring stories of genuine courage straight to your feed.